that was handy. That basket was handy. And I was grabbing a bunch of, thank you, I was grabbing plates and cups and napkins and forks and stuff, and trying to, like, I was doing like, and that was on the floor in the storage room there where all the paper goods and stuff. And so I just went, I was like about to drop stuff, and I went like that, because I was like, well, I can't break it. It's paper goods. I'll throw it in there. And now I can carry that upstairs to the gathering room after services, where they're having a little birthday party. It's not my birthday, no. I know you were wondering. Everybody was wondering. Yeah. Oh, Andy, did we miss that? Did we miss the birthday? Okay, we are going to be in Psalm 19 and Psalm 22. And then we'll go from there next week. But we want to cover both of these this week if we can, and both in total if we can. Certainly get the majority of both of them done. So I mentioned last week that we'd be in Psalm 19 and Psalm 22, which may have something to do with why several people are out tonight. That I made the mistake of telling them which psalms. They looked it up ahead of time and said, no, I don't like that psalm, so we'll go somewhere. So we've been talking about the balance of faith, and we've been talking about faith with ingredients, if you will, that aren't necessarily assumed to be a part of strong, ever developing, so it's growing faith. Because, we can't arrive. Let's remember that. We can't arrive in faith. We can come to faith, a measure of faith, even a saving faith. But if we ever think we've arrived, we have potential problems coming. Don't forget, our adversary knows exactly who, how, and when to attack. And so in this ever-developing, ever-strengthening, hopefully, faith, certain things can go in it that you might not think be a part of it. What's your favorite steak sauce, somebody? Say anybody.
A1.
Okay, all right. Any Heinz 57 people? Okay. No?
If they're out of A1.
If they're out of A1. Okay, yeah, that's good. If they're out of A1, that's fine. So the A1 is probably what I hear the most, Heinz 57. I'm pretty much 50-50. Either one of them, I love them both. But who thinks they know the oddest, I don't know, it may not seem odd to you, ingredient in your favorite steak sauce A1?
Just orange in there.
Are they in there? They may be in there. I don't remember if they're in there or not, but
I think there's like orange zest, orange peel, or something.
Yeah, there's that in it. Raisins. I don't know. When you look at a bottle of something that's your favorite steak sauce, your favorite, some kind of seasoning, some kind of something you based a meat with or something before grilling it, you ever kind of look and go, now who thought that was, I mean, I get somebody one day thought, I bet peanut butter and chocolate are good together. Okay, that doesn't seem odd. Okay, and so the Reese's was born or whatever. And I bet that chocolate and coconut would be good together if you like coconut. And so that stuff's not odd, but who thought, I'm looking to build the best steak sauce in America. I bet raisins would really, see, faith can be that way. Faith can be a situation where not only can something be in there, it might have to be in there for that faith to go, grow, be sustained, and come in handy at the moment I need it the most. So we've been talking about that and seeing some of that in this study in Psalm. So I said we'd go to Psalm 19. So I want to move pretty quickly through Psalm 19. I want to spend the better portion in Psalm 22. Psalm 19, I simply want to say, I want you to notice in this psalm, which is not lengthy, it's not real brief, but it's not lengthy. I want you to notice the balance. Faith has balance. Now, there's a lot of ways I could mean faith has balance. In fact, Psalm 22, I'm going to show you some more balance that might be brought to sustaining, empowering moment I need it the most, faith. But when I say balance here in Psalm 19, I'm saying the Lord has not left us with one bullet. Okay? The Lord has not left us with one bullet. Now fire that bullet, and if it doesn't land as if it doesn't strike as I want it to strike, I got nothing. I got nothing left. I had a buddy call me today, and there's a family member of his from the Bellevue congregation that's probably not going to live much longer, and they don't necessarily have a statement that 48 hours or something of that nature, but it's just where she is, and they know where she is and in her care and so on. So he just wanted to tell me up front where things were, and when that takes place, they wanted to know if I would do the funeral for her. I said I'd be honored to do so. So in the means of explaining this to me, and then talking about that, he said, well, you know our family, you know this, and so on and so on. And he goes, he said, did you ever hear the phrase, it scared me for a second, he goes, did you ever hear the phrase, well, you ain't much, but you're all we've got. Something like that. And I was like, well, thanks, man. That sort of thing. And he wasn't finished with his statement. He goes, I don't want you to think that's what we're saying, that's what we're doing. We've had you targeted to do this funeral for a long time. We just hadn't let you know. But he started out by going, well, have you ever heard the phrase, you're not much, but you're all we've got? And that's not how to start something with somebody, right? Okay. That's not a situation that we've got in faith. When we exercise one thing and then it doesn't land for somebody else, if we're trying to be evangelistic, if we're trying to explain our faith, give it support, or find support in it ourselves, I've got this and that's about all I've got. So when I say balance related to Psalm 19, faith has balance, is that the Lord has given us multiple things. Now there's two in particular mentioned in Psalm 19. There's two in particular, I think, that are highlighted. And He's given us more than that. And we can find some of these other things in some of the other Psalms and certainly throughout Scripture. But I want to highlight two from Psalm 19. Faith has balance. The first 6 verses are talking about what? Look at the first 6 verses and give me a summary of what the first 6 verses are talking about related to faith. When I say we're not left with one bullet, okay? But this is one bullet. It's not the only one I have, but this is one, and it's a big one, a strong one, and an empowering one. And it ought to be in every holster, every Christian holster. We ought to have this. And what is that in the first 6 verses? It's proof that there is a great God. It's proof from nature. We used to, Dad used to refer to in Psalm 19 God's big Bible of nature. And then I'll tell you about the second half in a minute, starting in verse 7. And I always thought that was a good summary. The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament shows His handiwork. This happens day after day, verse 2. And night unto night reveals knowledge. There's no speech or language where their voice is not heard. The line has gone out through all the earth, the words to the end of the world. Okay, so the depth and the distance, the certainty that there is a great God simply by walking outside and observing nature. Okay? Faith has balance. And one aspect of that balance deals with evidence. Evidence. Nature screams, there is a God. And basically what David would say right here, if you partnered the first 6 verses here and what is said in some other Psalms with other things Scripture says about God's handiwork, then a man's got to be a fool to walk outside and say accident. That I'm looking at the greatest accident. That's foolish. I have said over and over and over through the years that you've got to work harder to believe Big Bang or anything relating to that you've got to work harder to believe accident than you do design. And it's amazing how far people will go to defend and how silly they'll look to refuse design, a design that demands a designer, as we say. So we're not left in faith with, well, we've got this one thing and this one thing's got to work for everyone at all times and for me at all times. The first 6 verses are dealing with a powerful thing. Look what else he says. Their line has gone out through all the earth and their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tabernacle for the sun, which is like a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, and rejoices like a strong man to run its race. Its rising is from one end of heaven, and its circuit to the other end, and there is nothing hidden from its heat. All that we can learn, nature screams as we sing, there is a God, He is alive. There is a great God. And in Psalm 19, in the first 6 verses, we've got one thing that we're given relating to faith. But faith doesn't have to put, what do we say, don't put all your eggs in one basket. The Lord has not put all eggs in just one basket in this thing we call faith. Now, somebody can say, well, I mean, yeah, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's one basket. That's one big egg, and it goes in one big basket. Or Jesus, related to how God would save man, would say in John 14, after he begins by letting not your heart be troubled, believe in God, believe also in me. And you remember how the rest of that goes up until the disciple says, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how could we possibly know the way? And he says, I'm the way, the truth, the life. No man comes to the Father except by me. Well, or through me, we might say. Okay, that's a singular egg to a singular basket in terms of how God goes about saving man. It's through Jesus, and it's only through Jesus. Okay, I get that. I get in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. What I'm saying is, with regard to faith, that's not the only thing we have, is to have to walk out and I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say yes. This would be crazy to be a great big accident. Again, I'm not belittling the weight of creation evidence to our faith. But faith is a term that encompasses not just our belief, it also encompasses growing our faith, growing our belief, walking through that belief and holding on to that belief when it's difficult. So, as I say, faith has balance, and it's evidence in the Psalms. Look at the 7th verse and finishing out the Psalm. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. Now, by the way, as we walk through verse 11, 7 through 11 right now, as we walk through, look at how many different things are secured right here. The soul, verse 7, is converted. The wise, or the simple rather, becoming wise. That's in verse 7. I love it when a preacher calls me in the middle of class. We're gonna,
Watching you, he's called correction.
yeah. He would do that. Watch this. This is going to be fun. teaching class with a question mark. Like, I guess you're not teaching this quarter? He probably thinks we start at 7 and 6:59. Oh, he gave me a lot of lead time. Okay. So when you look at verse 7, you've got the law doing what? The law of the Lord, which we'll talk about in a second in a broader sense. We've got the soul being converted in verse 7. Second half of verse 7, we've got the simple becoming wise. In verse 8, we've got the heart being able to rejoice. Second half of verse 8, the commandment of the Lord is pure. We've got the eyes becoming enlightened. Now verse 9, the fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. So there's endurance to this. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, even much more than fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. Moreover, by them your servant is warned, and in keeping them there's great reward. So, how many boxes between verse 7 and 11 can be checked? Checked as worth it, checked as a blessing, considering or concerning the law of the Lord. It's verse 7 has 2, verse 8 has a couple, verse 9 has a couple, verse 10 and 11 kind of have one central theme probably. You've probably got 7 or so in verses 7 through 11. You've probably got 7 different boxes checked. Discussing not only God's big Bible of nature, like I said, verse 6 is dealing with God's big Bible of nature. Nature screams, there is a God, nature teaches. But God's better Bible of Scripture. That's verse 7 through not just 11, really, through verse 14. So let's look at 12 through 14. Who can understand his errors? Cleanse me from secret faults. Keep back your servant also from presumptuous sins. Let them not have dominion over me. Then I shall be blameless, and I shall be innocent of great transgression. Now, innocent of great transgression, innocent's not innocent because I never missed. I never misfired. I never, what do we say about sin? Miss the mark. I never missed the mark. Okay? That's not what made him innocent or blameless. Verse 14, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength, sometimes some translations, my rock and my redeemer. By the way, when you look at verse 12 and 13, I want you to consider this. I want you to consider there's 2 different sins referenced in verse 13. 2 different types of sins. What are they? Well, there's those, let's take the second one first. There's those presumptuous sins. What is a presumptuous sin? Presumptuous has, in a root sort of word to presumptuous, is to presume. If you go all the way over to, in the New Testament, to Romans 6, close of Romans 5, beginning of Romans 6, eventually, early in Romans 6, he's going to say, what shall we say then about all this grace he's wrapping up chapter 5 with? What do we say about that? Do we just then continue in sin because of all that God's got plenty of grace? Do we just continue in sin that grace may abound? And he says, God forbid. And then he goes on to say why that should be forbidden in our minds, that we don't look at grace as license. He goes on and talks about that and why it wouldn't make sense for us to look that way at God's grace. Well, by the same token, to presume upon God's grace is to kind of have this idea that, God, I know that Scripture says this, and I'll be honest, I'll probably have a guilty conscience later, and I'll be honest, I've probably told somebody else not to do that before, but the presumptuous sin, presuming upon something, presuming in any number of things, Keep me from presuming on you. Okay, there's that sin, which means it's a sin that I what? That I'm aware of. And I don't mean I'm aware of after the fact when it's called to my attention. It's a sin that I probably, listen, I say this, and I'm speaking to myself as much as I'm anybody else when I say this, and I say it a lot. I say it in a lot of settings, classes, sermons, over many years now. I believe usually, I'm not throwing a blanket over every thought of man and every thought of the Christian. But I believe most of the time, if most of the time, thankfully it wouldn't have kept me from living with Him forever because of His grace and my relationship through Christ with Him that would cover all that. But if we could be handed a grade, a broken down, this is your whole life, book of life. Andy, here's your book of life. In chapter 1, sins. If I was handed that, walking into heaven, I would imagine that at least by the time I hit a certain point in life, when I was capable of understanding, after being taught, and after becoming a Christian, I probably knew that to say that, do that, think that, or fail to do, say, or think that. Because there's sins of omission, and just like there's sins of commission. Something I should have done or should have said that I did not. That really would have been the will of God. That I probably knew that. That's presumptuous sin. So we took the second one first. Go back above it and in verse 13. Keep back your servant also from presumptuous sin. But what's at the close of verse 12, just before it? Keep me from secret faults. That's not the secret that nobody knows. Keep me from, even though nobody else would know, keep me from that. That would be easy. These are unknown to me. I don't even want to sin against you when it wasn't dawning on me at the moment. Because, let me give you this example. My dad had this idea, this saying, and he used it with all three of his children as necessary. And I can promise you he had to use it more with my brother and me than he did with my sister, just because of the nature of his sons comparative to the sister. Dad, I didn't mean to, okay? That one time I broke a window playing baseball in my backyard with 3 friends that lived on my street. And we broke the window in the basement by the washer and dryer that was down there. And this was, I'm the one that hit. I hit it. I hit the ball. I broke the window. And I didn't mean to. So, talking about the holster, I got that right here. Oh, it's all right. I got this. I didn't mean to. And it's not that that's not true. I wasn't sitting, they weren't saying, bet you can't break that window. I didn't mean to. And so I'm thinking that's going to get me out of it, right? Or at least it won't be too bad, right? And what does Dad say? Son, I know you didn't mean to. But you've got to learn to mean not to. And that's completely different. What is meaning not to? Hit the other way. That's meaning not to, right? That's meaning not to. Son, I know you didn't mean to, but you got to mean not to. Boys, hit the other way, please, not toward the house, right? And so there are times when I wasn't meaning to sin. Maybe I wasn't even aware. But keep me from those two. Create in me a person, a spirit, a heart, a desire, a chasing after this idea that I don't want to commit those either. So I'll be thinking how not to rather than just I didn't mean to. So those are the secret. We sing a song, there's a hymn I got to remember the title of the hymn. It'll be familiar to you. It's, oh, goodness. No, it's similar, though. If I have wounded any soul today. If I have wounded any soul today, if I have caused one foot to go astray, if I've walked in my own willful way, dear Lord, forgive. Now, there is another verse, though, right? He says, I think there's three to that one. Forgive the sins I have confessed to thee. Forgive the secret sins I do not see. Would you even forgive just my misses it wasn't a presumptuous sin? So the writer of that hymn knew something about maybe even this passage that I do not see. I don't see it. I'm not cognizant of it. It's not that I'm brazen. I'm just human. So Psalm 19 can be divided, I think, fairly into two separate sections. The first 6 verses and then verses 7 through 14, which complete the chapter. And what you've got right here in faith, an example of faith, the pursuit of faith, the maintenance of faith, the retrieval of faith at the moment I need it the most. What is faith? How many different things go into that? That faith has balance. That I have nature screaming that gives me a faith boost every single day. Reminded of God's handiwork, through His handiwork, reminded of God's power, reminded of His existence. And then I've got God's Word, His law, His precepts. Faith doesn't just have that, faith requires that. There are times when I don't have something accessible to me that would be really good for me in that moment, and God has not left me then destitute. Didn't bring my Bible. Maybe I've got a Bible in the back seat. You know, like most preachers, I've got like 87 Bibles, so, let me know if you need one. But no, I don't. But I'm driving. Look at that rainbow. But I'm outside walking, I listen, and I hear the birds. Maybe my mind goes to Matthew chapter 6. If God so feeds who? Consider the lilies of the field, feeds the birds of the air. Really not much more so supply for you and me. Middle of Matthew 6, middle of the Sermon on the Mount. Faith has balance. It's the balance of what I can see. Just because, and I used this verse last week, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. That doesn't mean that there's nothing seen. That doesn't mean there's nothing to be seen. It's just referencing that those things that can't be. Not saying nothing is able to be seen. So there's that which I can see, taste, touch, experience, be wowed by. I mean, my goodness, you want to talk about a faith experience for somebody that was taught well before this to think this way, was the birth of your child, to witness the birth of your child, be in the room, cut the cord. Wow, this is amazing. This is right. Okay, so there's those things, and then there's the laws and the statutes and the precepts and see, I need all of that. Faith has balance. Faith doesn't just have balance. Faith must have balance. Therefore, I've got to take in all of those things. And there's other things he could have listed there, just two specific categories in Psalm 19. So, let's go to Psalm 22. Faith does these things, now hear me, all at once. Okay? So Psalm 19, faith has balance. Psalm 22, faith does these things. Okay? Be interesting to see now what he sends me back. as he is probably totally embarrassed. The preacher ought to know better. Yes, you should have. Anyway, Psalm 22. Faith does these things all at once. Now, what I mean by faith does these things all at once, I'm going to show you 7 things out of Psalm 22 that I thought were important to draw out. 7 different things. And when I say faith does this, that means an active faith in faith. Remember, faith without works is dead? That statement? An active faith has to choose things regularly. And when I say faith does these things all at once, I don't mean by autopilot. I mean by my selection. And when I say all at once, I mean in the words in the heart of the author of this psalm attributed to David. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Well, it is attributed to David. I'm sorry. Psalm 22 is attributed to David. That he's going to choose to do these things. So remember last week I said what gets put in the pot, what gets put in the stew and the soup, that kind of thing that might not have known had to be there, but then later that was the very thing that gave it faith, the needed taste at the time, so to speak. Listen to the 7, see if you can find these things. First 2 verses. Faith is human and can have doubt. Do you get the feeling that sometimes we talk about faith and doubt as if they cannot coexist? Yeah. I think sometimes we talk as if there's doubt, there's no faith. If there's faith, there's no doubt. Well, that depends on how you define faith and how you define doubt. There's some mighty faithful people that have sounded like, I don't understand this. I need something from you on this. Could you give me a sign, so to speak? See. So I want to be careful, but look at verse 2, or the first 2 verses, rather. My God, why have you forsaken me? Where else did we hear that? At the cross. Why are you so far from helping me? That's the feel. Now, he may not be so far from helping me, but that's the feel, isn't it? Obviously, he writes it, that's the feel. Now, here's a direct quote from Scripture, He is not far from any one of us. So God says about Himself, that's not true. In terms of ability to be there in an instant, help in an instant, strengthen in an instant. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? But that's the feel. And from the words of my groaning. Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but you do not hear. And in the night season, and am not silent. What's going on? But look, in the first 2 verses here, David, as it's attributed to David, he calls him his God. He says his God has the ability to help, right? That's at the close of verse 1. Why are you so far from helping me? You know who you don't ask that of? You don't ask that question to or about? Somebody you don't think can help you. So there's a statement of faith, my God. And there's a statement of faith that you could be helping me. And yet, in verse 2, you don't hear me. Barry.
This may not be the best example, but you mentioned you have both faith and doubt at the same time. Moses, when he struck the rock instead of spoke to it, would that, obviously, that may not be the best example, but, I mean, obviously, he was a man of faith. He's listed in the by faith chapter in Hebrews.
Sure.
But, would that, I mean...
Well, have you ever heard the phrase...
Or he wouldn't have struck the rock, and he would have spoke to it if he wouldn't have doubted.
Yeah, have you ever heard the phrase that if you want something done, want done right, you got to do it yourself? You heard that? People listen. I had a dad that would have, and some of that's generational, his generation, but it's also his wiring. Just move, everybody move, everybody get out of the way. That I'm going to pull that tree out of the ground, and now in about an hour, y'all are going to take me to the hospital. But in this hour, I'm going to pull that tree out of the ground, okay? Because it's there and because I believe I can, or I can do it better than you. You know, that kind of thing, right? And yet faith in God ultimately has to reach a point where he said, I can't in this particular thing, and I'm going to have to rely on you. So you get both here. You get humanity and even doubt in one who's called after a man after God's own heart, and obviously a man of faith. Look how he opens so many Psalms, and even in this Psalm as we go along, the great statements of faith in God that are coming. But he opens it with, if you want to call it doubt, or don't understand, confusion, weakness. So faith does these things all at once in one Psalm. You get it all. Verse 3 through 8. Somebody read verses 3 through 8 and see if you don't hear this. In verses 3 through 8, faith remembers place, and I don't mean a physical geographic location. Remembers place, remembers power, and remembers prophecy. Okay? Look at verses 3 through 8 and see if you can see a writer who remembers his place comparative to God's place, who remembers God's power and remembers prophecy. We'll talk about that. Verses 3 through 8.
Yet you are holy, of you who are enthroned upon the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted, they trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were delivered. In you they trusted and were not disappointed. But I am a worm and not a man, a reproach of men and despised by the people. All who see me sneer at me. They separate with their lips. They wag their heads, saying, Commit yourself to the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, because he delights in him.
Now, find me, thank you, Barry. Find me a David here, a writer of this psalm, remembering God's place. I'll give you a hint. It's really early in what he just read. About as early as you can find it. You are holy. Okay, in the midst of the groaning of the first two verses, but. Now the word but is what? Contrast. Comparative to this, here's how I feel, here's how these people act, here's how this happened, here's how whatever. Here's how. But, that's looking over here, but when I look over here, I see a contrast, but you, as opposed to, here's what I know. And faith in the midst of even doubt does well to remember God's place, and especially God's place comparative to His, to mine, to yours. So faith does that. And he does it early in this psalm. Find where he remembers God's power. Where's that? Well, look at verse 4 and 5 and 8 especially. They cried to you. They trusted, verse 4, they trusted in you. That is, instead of in themselves. They trusted and you delivered. They cried to you and were delivered. They trusted in you, were not ashamed. In you, in you, in you, instead of in themselves. Why in you? Why in Him? They're referencing His power. And you delivered. You skip down to verse 8. He trusted in the Lord. Let Him rescue him. Let Him deliver him, since He delights in him. Where in verses 3 through 8 do you not only remember place in faith, remember power, but also remember prophecy? What he's doing is he is giving a history lesson, and that's the other side of prophecy. Things prophesied, and then they come. And how often did the Lord tell His children when they were in bondage, in slavery to Egypt, for example? How often in the wilderness, how often leading up to this point in the history of God with His people, were the people of God told something would come? And it came. Faith remembers. And it has to. In the midst of doubt, first two verses, in the midst of angst, in the midst of, I'm not feeling good about this, but at the same time, same psalm, just a couple of verses apart, this one who's only human and has this, if you want to call it doubt, concerns, weakness, launches into a contrast. By choice, I will remember these things about you. Look at verse 9 and 10 now. There's a third thing. There's a third thing that faith does. And it can do all these things, and it needs to do all these things in the midst of a battle. That's the point, by the way. Psalm 22, he's in the midst of a battle. Personal battle. Look at verse 9 and 10. Somebody read that.
You brought me out of the womb, or brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you, even at my mother's breast. From birth I was cast on you. From my mother's womb you have been my God.
In verse 9 and 10, faith gives a historical account of God with you. Faith remembers history of God and you. You need to remember history. How often did God go back and tell the children of Israel when they were quickly forgetting? And that's when they would slip into problems. Look at the book of Judges, for example. Why would God have to raise up so-and-so? And there were different so-and-sos that we, as deliverers, that we call judges. Why did He have to raise them up? Because for a while He had to let them be in some form of bondage. Why? Because, now here's a phrase from the book of Judges you're going to see over and over. Then the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. Look at Judges and see how many times you see that phrase. Then the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So, and later on, and God raised up so-and-so when it was time. And oftentimes, in the Old Testament especially, God has to go back and remind His people, did I not this, but you would not this. I often refer to this phrase, these two words together, that you need to be as busy as you can be as soon as you can. And I think this is easier to say to a 45-year-old than it is a 15-year-old. Okay? Of course, just time. Building yourself a God resume. Now, what's a God resume? Well, what's a resume? I mean, if Daryl tomorrow decides he's going to pursue some headhunter calls and says, we'd like to talk to you about this position at XYZ Corporation, and would you be willing to talk to us? And for whatever reason he decides he's willing, and they ask him to bring a resume, of course, if they decide to pursue him, I don't know why he has to bring a resume. They probably know his resume or they wouldn't have called him, but you get the point. Or Daryl just decides to bring a resume. What's he bringing? He's bringing a history of, this is what I've done. It wouldn't be a bad idea for you to have one. Not of what you've done, but what God has done in and with you. David's, when I came up against this, God did this. When I came up against this, God... Do you have that accessible to your mind and heart when you need it? Because you're going to have to be able to retrieve that type of confidence and certainty at some point in the face of something that's not giving you much time to react. Have you built your God resume? So in verse 9 and 10, David shows, I know who you are. And he tells God exactly who he is. So we've got humanity, even doubt in the first two verses. Verses 3 through 8, we've got quick remembrance of place, power, even prophecy. In verse 9 and 10, faith does this too. At the same time, at least faith right here, remembers history. The history of God with His people. They're in the history of God with Him. And you need to have that. The next section is, and I said we had 7 things in this psalm, so we've got to do 4, 5, 6, and 7. Obviously, we'll start with those next week. If the next one was only 1 or 2 verses, I'd go ahead and do it real quick. But the next one is the longest section in terms of one thing, and that's verses 10 through 18. But you might scan that real quick. Scan verses 10 through 18. We don't just have faith doing humanity or doubt. We have it remembering place, power, and prophecy. We have it recalling history. And in verses 10 through 18, faith is aware. You ever heard the phrase, somebody says, I like a self-aware man, you know? Hey, Dennis, how did we joke this? This is too good to pass up. How did we joke before we started class? I don't remember what I said that had you say, I said I was... Yeah, I said, I thought about you the other day. I was flipping channels and the movie Ferris Bueller was on, and there was this, it was at the start of this particular scene, and he is playing a guy. They're trying to fake out the school principal and say that this girl's dad is here to pick her up, and his name is Mr. Peterson. And they keep talking. He said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Peterson. Yes, sir, Mr. Peterson." And I told him, I thought about you several times the other night because I just kept hearing Mr. Peterson. And when I was about to tell him why, he said something like, "Were you thinking of it?" Can I say it? He said, "Were you thinking of a fat, bald guy?" and here's what I said. Now, I wouldn't have said that without what I'm about to say. I said, "No, if I was thinking that, I'd been thinking of myself." Okay, so somebody says, "I like a self-aware person." Right? I've been thinking of myself, right? When I say faith has to be aware, faith is aware. Faith is sensible. And we're going to talk about that in verses 10 through 18. We're going to see what is very sensible to David, about David, in verses 10 through 18. Faith is aware. If it's going to be a saving, strengthening faith, retrieving, able to be retrieved, it's got to be an aware. Faith has to have awareness, and we'll talk about what that means next week. So, verses 10 through 18 is aware. Verses 19 through 21 is specific. We'll talk about faith as specific. Verses 22 through 26, faith preaches, and I'll obviously talk about what I mean by that. Faith preaches, verses 22 through 26. And then verse 27 through 31, it has confident expectation. So we will finish out Psalm 22 next week and then get into another very short psalm that we can finish 22 and finish the entirety of another psalm next week. That'll be the plan. Thanks for being here.